So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to participate to this this nice workshop. So I'm going to give a talk about stochastic models for a population of bacteria with competition and horizontal transfer. So horizontal transfer, I will spend some time to explain you what it is. And my question is a question of asymptotic analysis. So I want to construct an asymptotic model for such populations. So this is joint work with Sylvie Méléard and T. Tran Viet. So Sylvie is from École Polytechnique and T is from Université Gustave Eiffel. And so I'm going to speak about horizontal transfer. So what is horizontal transfer? Well, it's typically what is known as transfer of plasmids. So plasmids are small circular DNA strains in bacteria, and they are able to be exchanged horizontally, which means not through descent, which is usually called vertically, but horizontally between individuals which are not necessarily related genealogically. And so what the bacteria do is that they send some sort of canne à pêche, they are fishing. They are sending a small flagellas. And so when they find some other bacteria of the same species, most often, then they construct a small tunnel, a small path between the two, and plasmids can be exchanged through this path. Okay, so this is what is called transfer of plasmids. And so more generally, there are other mechanisms of so-called horizontal transfer, but okay, you may think of transfer of plasmids, it's enough for my talk to have this in mind. And so what is important to know is that this is really something crucial biologically. So it is recognized as a major process in the adaptation of populations, of bacterial populations, such as Escherichia coli. So, and it may help them to have, to maintain and transmit some virulence. So if you think of pathogenic bacteria, then they may be more or less virulent, and those that survive are able to transmit their plasmids to other bacteria that will become as virulent because they will have the good mutations or the good proteins. So this is one effect related to horizontal transfer, transmission of virulence. Another very well-known one is the antibiotic resistance. So when bacteria are able to resist to antibiotics, they can share the genes responsible for this resistance with other bacteria using horizontal transfer. And there's another example of potential application of horizontal transfer, which is used by biologists such as Myriam El-Karoui. And the idea is use horizontal transfer to transfer bad plasmids to bacteria that are, for example, resistant to antibiotics. So we cannot kill them, but we can transfer them plasmids that hold bad genes or lethal genes, such as the CRISPR case 9. Maybe you know about that. It's something that cuts DNA and kills the cell. Okay, so horizontal transfer is something important. And my goal in this talk is to describe the joint evolution in a population of distribution of some evolutionary traits and population size, so with birth and death. And what I have in mind is to model some sort of trade-off in the plasmid dynamics. So basically, the idea is that having a plasmid is additional DNA, so it means more cost to maintain it and to copy it when at division and so on. So it has some costs. but it can give advantage, like in the examples I just gave here. And so there's a trade-off. It's costly, but it may be better in some situations. So what can happen? And so to illustrate what can happen, here are a few simulations of a model I'm going to describe in a few minutes, just to motivate the talk. So there's a time evolution. So horizontally you have time, and vertically you have the distribution of traits in the population. And this represents so the time dynamics of a population. And what you can see is that you may think, for example, of the traits as representing virulence, for example. And in the same model, you can have very different dynamics, like all those. And you may find, for example, dynamics like in the third, in the lower left picture, where the trait in the population increases up to some value where survival is no longer possible for the population. And so we have what is called evolutionary suicide. So evolution drives the population to increase the trait up to some point where it's no longer possible to survive. So there's nobody left after that. You may have some dynamics where you have evolution to this evolutionary suicide, but at some time, just before the extinction of the population, you have an emergence of a seemingly extinct mutant strain here. So it was present there. It seems to be absent here, but maybe a few of them remain, and then they are able to emerge again. And so you have a new branch in the evolutionary dynamics up to evolutionary suicide, or you even may have cyclic dynamics like those in the top pictures. Okay, so this I want to understand, to quantify, to analyze asymptotically this kind of dynamics. Okay, and so a key point that I'm going to insist on in the sequel is that I need to assume something on mutations. So you see the emergence, the re-emergence of this strain here is actually due to the fact that there are a few individuals with this trait here that remain present in the population. So they are very low densities, nearly extinct, but still a few of them remain. And at this time, they are able to take over the rest of the population. So for this to occur, we need that mutations are not too rare, because if mutations are too rare, it slows down this evolution, and it lets sufficient time to the mutant populations to go completely extinct. Here you see this strain here is completely extinct, and so there is no reemergence. Okay, so this is the main motivation. And so now I'm going to give some to describe the model. So first, let me describe the transfer, the horizontal transfer. So I assume that there's a one-dimensional trait x in some interval, say 0 plus infinity. And for example, you may think of it as related to the number of plasmids held by the bacteria. And the more plasmids, for example, the more virulent. And so, when there is a transfer between two cells, I assume what is called complete conjugations, which means that all transmids are transferred. And so if you assume that y is less than x, it means that the cell with trait y has less plasmids than the cell with trait x. And so transfer in this case means that the pair of traits x and y becomes xx, right? And now I need to assume some rates for these events to occur. And I'm going to assume that there is a frequency-dependent trait, which means that actually, so in words, it means that all individuals with trait X peak at some given rate, pick one of all the other bacteria, and then there is transfer. So it means that with rate nx, which is the number of X types in the bacteria, there is a random trait picked with probability y, picked with probability ny over n, and then this is multiplied by tau, which is measuring the frequency of horizontal transfer. Okay, so this is an assumption, and of course we could have chosen lots of other rates. It could be density dependent, or other examples, but we chose this one for two reasons. So the first one is that it's supported by some biological data, so I refer here to this article and the references therein. And the other one, I'm going to give it in 2 slides. Okay, so before explaining that, let me complete the description of the model. So it can be seen as a toy model for several reasons. You will see it's not so complicated in terms of parameters, but it's already enough difficult to study this model. So I stick on a toy model, which is inspired from other works that make similar scalings. So Duret and Maber in 2011, Bouvier, Coqui, Esmadi in 2019, already consider similar parameter scalings. But our model is different because there is transfer and because it's more general. Okay, so what is in the model? First, we have a scaling parameter, k, which is going to scale the size of the population. So I assume that the initial population is of size of order k, proportional to k. And I'm going to let k go to infinity. I will denote nt or ntk when the dependence with respect to k will be important, the total number of individuals. And I assume that the trait space is discretized, so it's a subset of the interval 0, 4. 4 is just because we need to pick some value. And I assume that it's discretized with mesh delta, so my traits are k delta with k integers. Okay, and I denote by nx of t the number of individuals holding this trait x. Now, what can happen to these individuals? First, we can have birth. So I assume that each individual with trait x has birth at some rate which depends only on its own trait. So it's b of x, and it's 4 minus x. So it's something modeling that it's harder to divide when the trait is large. So it's the cost of plasmids here. The more plasmids you have, the harder, the longer it is for division, for cell divisions. And now I have some other parameter, which is the mutation probability. I'm going to come back in a few moments on that. I will assume that with some probability that depends on k, in some specific way, there is, at a birth event, there is a mutation, and then I assume very simple mutations. The individual with trait X will produce a mutant which has one more plasmid, for example. So X plus delta, the trait. Okay, so it's unidirectional mutations. We could have considered bidirectional, but it would be more complicated, but still possible. And if there is no mutation, so with probability 1 minus pk, it's just a clone that is added to the population, so with the same trait X, right? And now this is for birth. For death, now I assume some density dependence, meaning that the individual with trait X die at some rate, which depend, so not on X, it's a typo, sorry, depends on NT, the total number of individuals, and it's given by this formula. So one is a common mutation, death rate for all cells. And then the more individuals you have that are in competition with you, the faster you die. Okay, so it's just C times the scaled population size, NT over K. Okay, so this means that, so this is density dependence in the sense that the more individuals you have in the population, so the higher the density, the higher the death rate. And horizontal transfer, I already gave you the mechanism in the previous slide. So this is summarized in this way. We have a transition, a pair of individuals XY becomes XX with a rate which is tau. So for each pair of individual, which is tau over n. And this only occurs if X is larger than Y. Okay, so now if you sum up all these rates with the size of the population with trait X and Y, then you get this formula here, okay? Because NX and NY are the number of individuals with trait X and Y. Okay, and now I have to choose also an initial population size. For the moment, I skip that. I'll come to that in a few seconds. Okay, so first of all, let me give another motivation for the choice of frequency-dependent horizontal transfer rate, and it's given by this slide here. So I describe what happens when k goes to infinity. So let me come back. K occurs only here, right, in the rates and also on the initial population size. So basically, I assume that the initial vector of population size divided by k converge to something. And then I want to know what happens to the system in this limit. And so actually, it's very classical to prove that this process, 1 over k nxt nyt, converge to some deterministic function nxt nyt. And here, for simplicity, I assume that there's no mutation, and I assume that there are only two traits, X and Y. It could be written in more general settings, but for the moment, let me just restrict to this case. And so in this case, what do you get? You get that its solution, Nx and Y is solution to an ODE, and the ODE is saying that the time derivative of Nx is Nx time a growth rate, right? And the growth rate is R of X. So R of X is just B of X minus D. I forgot to write down this. And then you have, so there is the competition. So competition rate is, R of X is 4 minus X minus 1. So R of X is 3 minus X. Sorry for that, I forgot to write it down. 3 minus X here. Then you have the competition. So the competition is C times the total population size, which is here Nx plus Ny. And then you have the transfer. So the transfer adds you a new individual of trait X if Y is less than X. And this occurs with this rate. So Nx times Ny over Nx plus Ny times tau, right? And then I remove an individual with trait Y, okay? And so this system is giving you the large population dynamics when there is no mutations. And what is useful in this choice of frequency-dependent transfer rate is that you can make a change of variables in this system of ODE. So if you call n the sum of nx and ny, and q the proportion of x individuals, so nx divided by n, then you get a new system of ODEs, and the dynamics of Q is closed, right? So Q evolves as Q times 1 minus Q times some constant here. And so depending on the sign of this constant, you either Q converge to 0 if it's negative, or to 1 if it's positive. And so if it converges to 0, it means that you have extinction of X population, otherwise it's extinction of Y population. So this is something that is called usually in biology invasion implies fixation principle. It means that if you add a mutant, say X or Y here to a population, and that if it can invade, so for example, if the mutant is X, meaning that it can invade means that this is positive so that Q has a tendency to increase when Q is small. Well, then if it invades, it fixates, which means that actually everybody is going to have the mutant trait, so Q is going to converge to 1. So this is, for the mathematical technical point of view, this is the reason of the choice of frequency-dependent transfer rates, because then in this case, this dynamics is quite simple. Okay, so let me come back to the mutations. So the simulation, sorry. So what I showed you is just simulations of the model I just described. So here are a few others where the only parameter to change is tau, the transfer rate. So if tau is small, what do we get? We get that so transfer has a tendency, to increase the trait, right? Because it's removing y and replacing y by a larger x. So if tau is small, then you have a tendency to increase the birth rate, which is 4 minus x. Remember, it's larger at 0. So here you have a tendency to approach the trait 0, where birth is the best. Birth rate is the larger. Now, if you increase a bit tau, you get a dominant effect for transfer, which has a tendency to make the population trait increase. But then you have this re-emergence mechanism that seems to occur. And again, you are going to converge to 0, but in a more complicated way, right? And now if you take tau very large, so tau equal to 1, well, it's only transfer that remains, and you go to extinction, to evolutionary suicide, as I showed in the beginning. Now let me take an intermediate value, 0.7. In this case, these are different realizations, different samples of the simulation. So we change only the seed for the random number generator. So it's just the same dynamics. And you see that it's quite random. In the result, you see very different behavior. So it's really the threshold between several behaviors. So you may have evolutionary suicide. You may have evolutionary suicide after reemergence of a trait. You may have successive reemergence of traits in different patterns. Okay? So now let me come to the choice of mutation probability. I need to take P of k. So P of k is the probability of mutation at birth for any birth. I need to take it as k to some exponent minus alpha, where alpha is going to be between 0 and 1. So it means that mutations are rare. So this is quite reasonable from the biological point of view, but not too rare. So let me explain a bit what I mean by too rare. So actually it is known by several works that if you take pk too small, well, you have very rare mutations. And so actually mutations are going to occur one after another and let sufficient time in between for the competition between different traits to be ruled out. So in a sense, if there's a disadvantaged trait, it's going to be killed, completely extinct, when the next mutation occurs. Or if you have an advantage trait, it's going to fixate in the population, for example. Okay, so this, I'm not going to explain how you get this, but this is not so hard to understand. Actually, k is the order of the size of the population size of order k. So this choice for pk means that you need to wait interval lengths of order log k in between two mutations. And actually, in a finite population of size k, say for example a subcritical branching process, it takes you a time of order log k to hit 0 if you start from k, for example. So this explains this result. And so in this case, if you choose that in the simulations I presented, then we get something that looks like the evolutionary suicide case that I showed you before when tau was equal to 1, this case here. So it means that mutations are too rare. So I need to take something in between, so k to the minus alpha with alpha between 0 and 1 is something interesting. So the idea again is with this scaling of mutations, I hope that some traits which have a tendency to go extinct will not be completely extinct once their fitness will be positive, meaning that they have a tendency to grow again, for example. Okay, so now a few notations. So first of all, it will be important to, sorry, I forgot just to come back to the initial data here. So now what do I take for the initial data? Well, I assume that all individuals have trait 0, and I put them at equilibrium. So this size for N0 is what equals death and birth rates. Okay, if I take this as n here, well, you get exactly 4 for d of x, right? So this is the notion of equilibrium density for trait 0. Now, what happens for the other traits? Well, actually, since you have of order k to the minus alpha mutations, mutation rate, well, if you have a population of order k in a small time interval of order 1, you will get k to the 1 minus alpha mutant individuals. This is for trait 1. And then for trait 2, you will get k to the 1 minus 2 alpha, because you need to have 2 mutations, and so on. So this suggests to take this as initial condition. Okay? And at some point, you get 1 minus L alpha is getting negative, and then you instead of putting this integer part is going to be 0, which is written here, if you take L large enough. Okay, so I need a notation, which is the equilibrium density I just mentioned. Okay, so for trait 0, it was 3 over C. Well, for trait X, it's going to be 3 minus X over C, because the asymptotic evolution of the density of trait X is governed by this equation, which has n bar X as unique equilibrium. Okay, and now another notation is the invasion fitness. So what is the invasion fitness? I assume that I have a population X at equilibrium, so with this density, and I add a single mutant individual with trait Y. And I want to look at its growth rate, meaning birth rate minus death rate, right? And so this is what is defined as S of YX, the fitness of the mutant Y in the population X. So you have the birth rate, 4 minus Y. The death rate, 1 minus the total population size, which is approximated by n bar X times K, times C over K, because in the death rate, I have C over K times N, right? So all these cancel out, and you get X minus 1 in the end. And next, you have the transfer. So transfer is going to add you new individuals of trait Y if they are they are larger, if Y is larger than X. And otherwise, oh, there's a typo here, should be the indicator. Otherwise, it's minus tau if Y is less than X, right? So I get this formula for the fitness, invasion fitness. Okay, so now, wait, maybe a comment. For example, if you take Y larger than X, then you get tau, so plus something which is close to 0. So actually the fitness is positive just after 0, just when Y is larger than X, negative when Y is less than X, and then it decreases. I should have put a picture of that. So it's the fitness function is, maybe I have it somewhere in the sequence. No, I don't. Sorry, but okay. Take a pen and try to plot this picture on your paper. Okay, this function. It has slope -1. It has value minus tau just before 0, and it has value plus tau just after 0, and then decreases with slope -1. Okay. So now to explain the ideas behind the results I want to present, I need to give some results about branching processes to start. Okay, so what is a possible resurgence of a population? Well, it means that I need to follow the size of negligible populations of size k to some beta, but with beta less than 1. And the proper time scale to look at the dynamics of such population size is log k. Okay, so I'm going to look actually at the dynamics of the exponent beta, right? And beta is given by here, by this formula. It's logarithm of population size divided by log k, right? This is the exponent beta, which is here. Okay. Now, what would happen to a population with trait Y in the resident population of trait X. So I introduce a mutant of trait Y in the population of trait X at equilibrium. Well, actually, it could be approximated by a branching process, a binary branching process with birth rate 4 minus Y, and with death rate, so the death rate is 1 minus C nx over K, and then minus tau because I assume, say, Y less than X. Otherwise, there would be plus tau in here. Okay, and so this is a branching process. And so it makes sense to look at the dynamics of an exponent beta when it's for branching processes, right? So this is what this lemma gives. I consider a linear birth and death, so branching process ZT, with some birth rate B, some death rate D, for example, these ones. And I assume that it starts with some K to the beta. Then what can be said about the population size? Well, if I look at the dynamics on time scale log K, of the exponent beta, so the logarithm of 1 plus z over log k, well, this converges to some deterministic function which is given by this formula. Okay, so we have beta as initial value because it's the initial value of the exponent beta, and then we have a linear growth or decrease with slope b minus d. So birth minus death rate. So if b is larger than d, then this is an increasing function. And then you don't need to look at this. If if b minus d is negative, then this may hit 0. When it hits 0, you see that this is the smaller possible value for this quantity. And so you need to take the maximum with 0, right? So it's a decreasing affine function and then cut at 0. And actually, when you are at the value 0, you can prove that the process is indeed extinct. There is really no individuals with high probability in this process here. Okay, so this is the first lemma. Second one, actually, I'm going to need to consider branching processes with immigration, because actually, when I look at one population, well, it may behave locally as a linear birth and death process, but you may have mutations incoming from the previous population, okay? And so these mutations can be seen as immigration. So now, following the previous ansatz, I may be concerned with population of trait Y, which is X plus delta. It has this birth rate, it has this death rate, and it may have mutations incoming from trait X. And if X follows some dynamics is of the order K to something, right? Then I need to take mutations, since mutation probability is K to the minus alpha, I get this rate of immigration in my population, nxt times K to the minus alpha. Now, if I assume that nx t of log K looks like some K to the beta, and I plug that in, what I get is an immigration at some rate K to the constant plus, so the constant is C minus alpha plus AS, right? So this is exactly what is considered in this lemma. I take the same process as above and I add immigration at some rate K to some constant, and then E to some A times time S, right? And so in this case, you can prove a similar result as before. So you recover the same part here for the limit of the exponent dynamics. So initial value plus times B minus D. Then you may have incoming immigration that is more gives more individuals than that, if provided that this immigration is larger. So you get C plus AS, and you need to take the maximum of these two. Okay, I don't know if it's clear, but it's what you get in the exponential and the logarithmic scales for branching processes. Now, with this in mind, we can understand what the dynamic should look like. So to explain that, let me focus on a simple example where I only have 3 traits: 0, delta, 2 delta. Okay, I assume something on the parameters. I assume that tau is in between delta and 2 delta, and that 3 delta is out of the space, so 0, 4. So 3 delta is larger than 4. This is just to fix an example. Okay, now so what can happen at time 0 first? Well, my assumptions about the initial condition is that you have an exponent which is 1 for trait 0, 1 minus alpha for trait delta, 1 minus 2 alpha for trait 2 delta. These are the initial exponents. Now I compute the fitnesses. So the fitness of trait 0 is 0. This is always true. If you take the fitness of a trait in a population with same trait, it's always 0. And the initial population size is of the order 3k over c. Now for trait delta, what is its fitness? So remember the formula. It's tau minus, so the difference between these two traits, so it's delta. Tau minus delta, I assume that it's positive. So it means that trait delta has a tendency to grow. So then the limit exponent is going to be given by the previous lemmas as follows. So I have the initial value, 1 minus alpha, plus t multiplied times the fitness, which is tau minus delta, right? And I should take the maximum with the immigration due to mutations, which is 1 minus alpha, but this is always larger than 1 minus alpha. So I don't need to take the maximum here. For trait 2 delta, the fitness is now tau minus 2 delta, and this is negative. So it means that this trait has a tendency to decrease. So then its dynamics is going to be driven only by immigrations. And immigrations comes from this population beta 1. And so it's just beta 1 minus alpha, because I need to multiply this by k minus alpha. So I get beta 2 equal 1 minus 2 alpha plus tau minus delta t. This gives this first part of the dynamics. So this is for trait 0, for trait 1, for trait delta, for trait 2 delta. And so this is going to be correct up to the first time where trait delta has an exponent 1. In this case, what happens? So at this time, then I have competition between trait 0 and delta, because they are all of the same order of size. And so now I use the idea of the dynamical system for the dynamics of nx and ny. And you remember this invasion implies fixation principle. It means that the one who wins in the end is going to be delta. It invaded, so it's going to fixate, and so it's going to rule out trait 0. So at time t1, what we get is that the exponent for 0 is 1, the exponent for delta is 1, the exponent for 2 delta is 1 minus alpha. The resident trait, so the dominant trait, is going to be 1, so it means that it has null fitness, and it has this equilibrium density. Now the fitness of trait 0 in this population of trait delta is delta minus 2, which is negative. So I get here these dynamics for beta 0. And for trait 2 delta, the fitness is tau minus delta this time, and so it's positive. So now it's going to increase by himself, and I get this new formula. So let me just be a bit more fast. Here, what I get is that at this time, trait delta replaces trait 0, and so we have this blue curve, meaning that the dominant trait is delta. We have a negative slope for trait 0, and we still have a positive slope here for trait 2 delta, and so on. So let me just avoid to spend all my talk on that. Let me just show you the picture. After this time, the dominant trait is going to be 2 delta. So I have here a constant exponent. The trait delta is going to have negative slope, and the trait 0 is going to have a higher slope, which is going to be twice as large as before. So I get this picture, and so at this time, we have, again, trait 0 that becomes dominant, and so on. After this time, it becomes dominant. Then here we have the new exchange of traits here. And again, trait one is going to be, trait delta is going to be dominant, and so on. And so in the end, what I get is some periodic picture that I did not show in full, where you have piecewise functions for all the exponents beta, right? And so the main result we have, oh, sorry, before giving the main result, of course, this is for a certain choice of parameters, and we can change the parameters. For example, like there I choose parameters, delta is smaller, so I have 4 traits here. And again, we get a cyclic dynamics for the exponents beta, but you can also have much more complicated dynamics like this one. Here I have lots of, lots of traits, you see here. And at some point, you have actually no more exponents are going to be of order 1, which means that actually we are going to extinction of the full population, because all the population densities become negligible with respect to k. So this looks like evolutionary suicide. And at the end, all exponents are going to converge to 0 actually. And for other choice of parameter, you can get something which is much more complicated and which looks like something chaotic or whatever, I don't know. But of course, the dynamics is quite complicated. But what is interesting is that we are able actually to characterize the limit of the system as an explicit dynamics for the exponents beta. So the main result we can prove is the following. If I look at the logarithm of 1 plus nk delta, so the population size of trait k delta at times s log k, all that divided by log k, so this converges to some exponent that I call beta k, which is a deterministic function, which is continuous piecewise and solution to a system of ODO that I'm going to give in the next slide. And so this is the initial value, so I already explained that. And we have changes of slope that may occur depending on 3 cases, 3 situations. So either there is a new exponent which is the value 1, it means that you have a change of resident trait, as I explained. Either you have a new exponent at each value 0, which means that this trait is getting extinct, or there is a change of slope due to the fact that actually you have 2 driving forces for the change of an exponent. It's fitness, so its tendency to grow or decrease by itself, all alone, or the incoming immigrants, the mutations, the incoming mutations. At some time, it may happen that, for example, incoming mutations become more important than the effect of fitness, and so then you may have a change of slope. Okay, and so our result is going to give a rule to update the exponent slopes at each of such times. Okay, so the formula is just awful. Maybe it's not useful for me to explain it in details, but it's just summarizing all what I said. So, okay, I call L star the resident trait. And then I need to define the fitnesses. So actually the fitnesses are S of yx, but the slope due to fitnesses in the population may be, in the population L, may be S of L star, but it may be also some S of L minus I L star, because due to immigrations, if this is larger than the others, it may gives you individuals to all traits, to all larger traits with the same slope. So you have to take the maximum of several slopes, and this maximum needs to be taken for all slopes that may contribute to the immediate growth of trait L. So you need to have only exponents which are which have a distance alpha in between. So beta L minus 1 should be equal to beta L plus alpha for immigration to potentially govern the dynamics, and L minus G should be distant of beta L by J alpha. Okay, and now the update rule for the time of of change of slope is governed by the three cases I described. So that this is why I have the infimum between three terms. Each of them is corresponding to one of the previous situations. Let me not explain it.
Yeah, excuse me, Nicolas, we are running out of time now.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and so this is mainly what I wanted to explain you. Just to conclude, how can we use this result? So actually, this is useful to perform simulations, as I showed, but it's also useful to make a theoretical study of the phenomenon I want to understand, which is re-emergence, cyclic re-emergence of traits. And actually, using this result, we are able to get a characterization of three different cases. So depending on the parameter values, either there is resurgence of trait zero at some time before extinction of the population, or there is evolutionary suicide, so extinction of the full population, or there are cases that we don't know exactly what happens, but okay, at least we have two criteria that give us two interesting behaviors, so resurgence of trait zero or evolutionary suicide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolas.
So, yes, we have, say, 3 or 4 minutes for some questions. Pablo Marquet has questions. Yes.
Yep. Let me see. Okay. Oh, thank you, Nicolas. Great talk. Very interesting. My question is actually 2 comments. One is if you have thought or what can you comment on the possibility that traits interact in a more mutualistic way, so that you integrate information and can actually solve a problem in the environment using those traits, instead of just competing with each other, or maybe some of them, or they could form all these alliances, you know, rock, seesaw, paper thing. So you can have a kind of dynamics of the traits themselves. And the other comment, if you can comment on the relationship between this lateral gene transfer and mutation. So, and why I ask this question, because somehow one tends to think that lateral gene transfer is a faster way of accomplishing the same as mutation, because you get new information, but you can get it, you know, it's like more a kind of a more a quantum jump, so to speak. You know, you get a big chunk of DNA with a lot of new genes, so you can perform different functions. And it might take you a long time to do the same or explore the same through mutation. So, and somehow there should be some relationship between both mutation, migration, and the intensity of the genes transfer. I don't know if you can say something about that in your toy model or just in abstract. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. About your first question, so the main point, actually the main technical point in this proof is that we need the invasion implies fixation principle to prevent coexistence of several traits. So this is really for technical reasons, because we need, what I just completely skipped in my explanation is what happens here at this time, precise time here, where we have exchange of resident population. And actually, if you have coexistence of the two, what you would expect is that these two can become equal to 1. And then we need to look at the time where you have 3 traits that have exponent 1, right? And for technical reason, because we use comparisons with branching processes and things like that, it's much harder to explain what is going to happen in this case here, when you have 3 traits simultaneously equal to 1. And actually, in our results, we have a restriction. For some initial conditions, it may happen that two exponents become equal to 1 at the same time. Nothing would prevent that. This could happen. In this case, well, we cannot, our proof doesn't work. So we need to stop there. So actually the convergence result is only on a time interval up to some bad event like this one. Right, and so mutualistic interactions are typically going to give you coexistence, and this is really interesting from the biological point of view. But from the mathematical point of view, this is really something. I mean, okay, maybe we could solve it, but it's already quite a mess to get through this proof. When you only have two traits. So okay, this is an open question. Of course, feel free to think about that. I don't have the answer. And about your second question, well, it's hard to what I would say first is that horizontal gene transfer is something which is quite costly for microorganisms, because it's a machinery which is quite. I mean, this is just. This is striking. If you look at the films that shows you how it works, this is something which is awfully complicated. You wonder how the bacteria have become able to do something like that. So maybe there's a cost for this. So as you explained, it's something that seems really advantageous for bacteria to be able to exchange horizontally. And indeed it is, because it gives antibiotic resistance, for example. But still, there should be some costs that I don't know how to measure. But okay, maybe this is not the best way for bacteria to produce mutants. Maybe it's less costly to do that in the usual way. But okay, this is just my own feeling.
Thank you.
So, another question? No? Well, I think that you are just touching a very deep problem, and this deserves to have a further discussion. So perhaps we will put this on a list to discuss in forthcoming seminars and things like that.
Yeah, and maybe sometime with face to face.
Yes, I think we have to continue this discussion, because their traits appear as simple labels, say. They are labels. And I think we, to understand the exchanges, we have to go deeper into different models for traits. That is, why don't think about graph or things like that? Because and also to examine more closely the traits, because the exchanges can also be viewed from a microscopic
You're right. This is really interesting, because you know, here I'm dealing with a trait which, as you say, is a label, but actually I'm just saying it's counting the number of plasmids, but of course it's really simplistic. And actually there's a huge problem in biology, which is the so-called genotype to phenotype map.
Exactly.
And you know that you have lots of alleles, lots of genes that contribute to phenotypes, and some are important, some have strong impact, some have small impacts, and all these models the one I present and the others I studied from adaptive dynamics, they assume that you may have small mutations, for example, and this, I mean, this can be discussed, of course, and it would be really interesting to have some models with genotype to phenotype map, and trying to know, how, I mean, answer the similar questions with this. But of course, this is awfully complicated, but interesting.
Well, but that's good. That is, open questions are always good. So thank you again, Nicolas, for this very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,